Personhood Theory, How Men Became Women and Babies Became Blobs. I'm drawing heavily from three books. One is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman, then Love Thy Body by Nancy Pearcey, and Same-Sex Marriage by Sean McDowell and John Stonestreet. Same-sex marriage was written in 2014, and it actually was written on that specific subject of same-sex marriage, kind of what should the church do since this is going to become legal. But they have a really great kind of history of how we got where we are, and that's really kind of the main thrust here is trying to understand how we got to this place where men are identifying as women and people are saying that babies are just a blob of tissue. But that's not the only thing we're going to talk about. The history, the development here is very critical to understanding how the church should respond to these ideas. And so when we understand how it all developed, we can begin to develop solutions and responses. And I think that's really important. Okay, so let me start with some quotes here from Carl Trueman. Again, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He says, "Why does the sentence, 'I am a woman trapped in a man's body,' make sense not simply to those who have sat in post-structuralist and queer theory seminars, but to my neighbors, to people I pass on the street, to coworkers who have no particular political axe to grind." That's really a great quote, and it's a great introduction to what I want to accomplish here. Why does that make sense to people now? So I think a lot of people can identify with me. I'm old enough to where I can remember when when men dressed up like women, it was usually for a comedy routine. And so now we don't assume that. Things have changed. So how did we get here? How does that now make sense to my neighbors and to people I know, not just people cloistered away in universities who are detached from reality? How has this become part of popular culture? He goes on, he says, "The so-called sexual revolution of the last 60 years, culminating in its latest triumph, the normalization of transgenderism, cannot be properly understood until it is set within the context of a much broader transformation in how society understands the nature of human selfhood." That's what we're getting at, the selfhood. The sexual revolution is as much a symptom as it is a cause of the culture that now surrounds us everywhere we look. So, I think a lot of us have often looked back on the sexual revolution as this thing that just kind of spontaneously erupted and caused all these problems for the past 60 years. But actually, in reality, it took a lot of other factors coming into play that led up to that. Kind of like, a volcano. There's all this stuff happening under the surface, that's invisible to the rest of us. Maybe there's tremors and rumblings, that can be detected, but for the most part, we don't see what's happening. And then all of a sudden, it just explodes, and that's spectacular and dangerous and life altering. That's kind of how the sexual revolution was. It was really just the eruption of the volcano, but there's all this stuff happening below the surface that we're going to explore here. So in short, he says, the sexual revolution is simply one manifestation of the larger revolution of the self that has taken place in the West. So he uses that terminology, the revolution. And it is only as we come to understand that wider context that we can truly understand the dynamics of the sexual politics that now dominate our culture. So the books I'm gonna I'm leaning on here, and the ideas I'm going to share with you are largely uh, focused on this idea of, like he says here, understanding the wider context, and kind of how we got to this place of sexual politics that are dominating our culture. But again, I want to offer more than just a history lesson here, um, because the response of the church and of Christians should necessarily be informed by that um, that history and that development of these ideas, um, in order to be effective. So if we really want to respond to people well, if we really want to try to minister in this new culture that we find ourselves in, we have to understand how it developed. All right, so let's do that now. Let's look at the what Truman calls the foundations of the revolution. This is condensing of a lot of information and in a long period of time, and a lot of books and other things that have been written on this subject. So keep that in mind. We're going to cover a lot of ground here in a hurry. But Truman goes back to J.J. Rousseau, um, and it's hard to nail down exactly when these ideas and thought began to change, of course. But this is a good starting point because Rousseau blamed society for his own sin, because he is basically good at birth and then perverted by external forces. And what we see here is the rise of a cult of childhood and youth. So, in other words, society um, influences us and and corrupts, and uh, it's the inner child. It's the youth within us that is pure and good. And you know when you look at this is not a new idea. It's not a new a concept. If you look at Thomas Sowell's book, A Conflict of Visions, he's dealing with largely the same thing, as it relates to society and economics and politics. The conflict of visions here is that you have someone like Rousseau who is saying that we are kind of inherently, silencing my phone, kind of inherently good. People we're born good. It's just society and religion and constraints like marriage and family that really ruin us. We're born good, and so if we can just give kids the right environment, they can stay good longer and that kind of thing. But this has really developed into a cult of childhood and youth, where age is no longer honored in our culture. Age and old age is avoided as much as possible. The aging process is we try so hard to shut it down. But the so in Saul's book on the conflict of visions, the other vision is, of course, that people are sinful and we need to account for that. We need to have laws. We need to have a judicial system. We need to have a government that um, helps protect the rest of us from basically our own sinful ways and our tendency to corrupt and so forth. That's why we have balance of power in the American government, because power corrupts and so forth. So that conflict of vision is between the idea that we're basically good, or the idea that we're born sinful and tend towards bad. So Rousseau is basically blaming society for whatever bad develops. And so then Truman talked about poets and how poetry comes into play here. And that's what happens is, most people don't read philosophy, but most people don't read, I think, but most people don't read philosophy. So how does the thinking of a Rousseau or someone else or a Nietzsche or someone get out there into culture? It's usually through art, through poetry, through music, through art, paintings, and whatever. Those ideas kind of make their way out into the culture. And he specifically talks about Wordsworth, Shelley, and Blake. A lot of material here, but they tried they promoted the ideas of turning inward from the false sophistication of outward society to the natural state of the unspoiled heart, freedom from marriage and religion. So freedom from institutional expectations and the child within. That's the pure person, or the person unspoiled by uh, the the um, the society around us. So that's kind of where the love stories went, and the adventure stories of going back to a natural state. In fact, Tarzan came out of that period. So Truman just makes the case for how the poets impacted the thinking of the larger culture. And then, of course, Charles Darwin had a big impact. He is credited with introducing the plausibility not just of evolution, but of sovereign self-creation. And most people aren't competent to critique Darwin. Most people haven't read Darwin. Most people don't know how to refute that. I would include myself in that to some degree, at least for most of my life. But again, what he's saying here is that Darwin not only introduced the idea that maybe we all came into existence apart from a God of some kind, and that would mean that we don't have the restraints, the moral and ethical restraints of a God. That means that we are sovereign, the self. We are our own creators. We are our own gods. We are our own kings. And so the implications of evolution weren't just scientific. They were very much there were many implications regarding how we think about ourselves and how what kind of identity we develop. So Nietzsche, a philosopher, came along, and it's like he described the death of God, if you will, the death of the idea of God, like unchaining the earth from the sun. And Nietzsche recognized that not only was this, uh, freedom, at least from his perspective, but it was also incredibly dangerous. So Darwin and scientifically um, rendered God unnecessary, and the philosophers and others kind of thought of God as implausible, and started describing God and theology as fairy tale or whatever. But Nietzsche recognized that in the process of all of this change in thought about God, uh, and he described it as the death of God or killing God. What that does is that means that humans take on the responsibility of God. Not in reality. We would understand that very differently. But that's what happens is, okay, well, if there's no God, then I decide what is right and wrong. I decide what I am. I decide what I'm going to do and to make my life meaningful and so forth. So Nietzsche recognized that was the responsibility we were taking on ourselves whenever we reject God. Karl Marx came along, the father of communism, or socialism, he came along and he saw a connection between social and economic conditions. In other words, he kind of broke down the differences between gender, between men and women. And as factories began to be built and the Industrial Revolution began to take place, they saw that women could work outside of the home, and in some cases the labor, as he says, the labor of men was superseded by that of women. And I'm missing a word here, but differences of age and gender have no longer any distinctive social validity. In other words, as the Industrial Revolution took place, there was no longer the need for this arrangement that had been in place for all of human history, where the husband was the provider and protector, and the woman was the one who made babies essentially and took care of the home. That with the economic changes that were happening, it was possible for women uh, to lead and govern men. It was possible in an age of law and progress and whatever for women to hold positions of power like never before. At least this is how Karl Marx saw it, and so he saw it breaking down and wrote about this and promoted it. This breaking down of the gender differences between men and women. And then Sigmund Freud, he he uh, he gave the idea of happiness, which is what Rousseau was really getting at. Was, true happiness was found in getting back to your uh, your childhood, that infant state, that pure infant childlike state. And so Freud gave that happiness a specifically sexual turn. And he tried to reduce happiness to genital pleasure and provided the compelling myth that sex is the key to what it means to be human. So that's a really key idea here. This is a major shift that takes place, and all these other people and ideas come into play here. But Freud really took that idea and turned it to sex. And that was major. So if happiness is only gained through genital pleasure, um, uh, then then sex is the key to what it means to be human. Um, so think about all the other ideas throughout history of what it means to be human. Really, um, it's perhaps not unprecedented before Freud for people to think that the key to who I am is sex. But certainly Freud managed to get that idea out there in a broad way that sex was the key. Sex was inherent in our identity as humans. And so then now we've seen the rise of the new left. He mentions Wilhelm Reich and Herbert Marcuse and others who made sex political. They brought it into the political realm, making Freud's myth what they call an that's anthropo that should be logical, anthropological, philosophical, and political watershed. Um, um, in other words, bringing sex into politics has changed everything. There are no limits to acceptable sexual expression. So, what the left has done is taken Freud's myth here, this Freud's idea of sex being key to what it means to be human, and they brought it into the realm of these are our rights. It's our right to have sex with whoever. It's our right to have whatever kind of sex. And so when identity becomes wrapped up in your sexuality, then it gets political. And then it becomes a matter of your rights to express yourself sexually however you want. So this is kind of an overview of how those ideas kind of all flowed together to give us what we have today. Truman also talks about the social imaginary and how um, I've got there the very simple clip art there of a lens. The social imaginary is how we view everything. That's how we view ourselves. It's how we view culture. It's how we view what is right and wrong. And that's just a hodgepodge really of beliefs and practices and expectations and assumptions. And so it's not real perhaps even well thought out or researched, but it's just how how we view things, and we don't always think through clearly how come we think things that we think, and this is true for societies as well. The social imaginary can just become just a collection of beliefs and practices and expectations and assumptions, and we don't often have to defend those, and therefore we don't often know exactly why we believe what we believe. So he says that the way we think about many things is not grounded in a self-conscious belief in a particular theory of the world to which we have committed ourselves. We live our lives in a more intuitive fashion than that. So we don't all sit down and research and read and say, okay, this is the theory of the world. This is the worldview that I hold. Not everybody does that. As he says there, it's usually a more intuitive thing where it just kind of happens, and we just kind of have these ideas, and we maybe don't even really give it that much thought. We just want to live our lives. We don't want life to be complicated, et cetera, et cetera. So, in other words, for example, um, you know, whereas maybe 20 years ago, a man might have laughed at seeing another man wearing a dress or dressed like a woman. Today, he probably won't laugh when he sees a man dressed like a woman. He won't think of it. He won't naturally, instinctively think of it as someone trying to be funny, as it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and before. But he might just not want to offend. He may not have really a very strong opinion about whether men can be women and whether men should dress like women. He just doesn't want to get involved. He just doesn't want to cause a ruckus. He doesn't want to offend people. He just generally wants to just get along with people. And so it's just intuitive. We kind of intuitively don't want to cause problems. We intuitively don't want to offend people. And so we just kind of go with it, right? And that doesn't mean we've thought it through clearly. That doesn't mean that we have a really clear theology, philosophy of men dressing like women. It just means we just kind of want to live life and be left alone or something like that. So that's the social imaginary. It just kind of evolves. It's kind of like a worldview, but it's just kind of this collection of beliefs, practices, expectations, assumptions, and those who are powerful and want to manipulate that social imaginary can definitely do so. And so he's not exactly arguing that we should just go with the flow, but that we just do, just kind of naturally what people do. And as part of the reason, part of the answer to how our society has come to this place of accepting certain ideas. And so he talks about two different ways of thinking that have emerged. And these are two new words probably for most of us. They were for me. But I think they're helpful to understand. So he talks about mimesis and poiesis. Okay, mimesis is someone who regards the world as having a given order and a given meaning, and thus sees human beings as required to discover that meaning and conform themselves to it. In other words, I think this is how people people used to think, and this is what Truman is saying, that most of Western culture at one time would have regarded the world as having a given order and a given meaning. It was God given. Even if you weren't sure what God made it, or what exactly you believed about the Bible or whatever. But pretty much everybody agreed that there was an order to things, and there was some meaning in life. And most people saw it as our responsibility to understand that meaning and live according to that knowledge. All right. But then poiesis has developed over time, as we've talked a little bit about, starting with Rousseau and Darwin and Nietzsche, and over time, poiesis has developed. And this is someone who sees the world as so much raw material out of which meaning and purpose can be created by the individual. We can manipulate the world to our own purposes. So, in other words, when you go back to our timeline here, and we see Nietzsche saying, the earth has been unchained from the sun, and we, we're taking on the responsibility of the gods by uh, by rendering God unnecessary, and like what Darwin made plausible, the idea that we are our own creators, that we get to create our own world, our own identity, and so forth. Um, so so when you get to that point, all of a sudden you are, as Nietzsche says, you're we're gods who are essentially in charge now of making all the big decisions. And so those big decisions um, are manipulating our world. We can think of this world as raw material for creating whatever purpose and meaning we want to create, and that includes our bodies. That includes um, our our opportunities and our situation, and just the world is really there's no inherent meaning in it. It's just Play-Doh that we get to shape however we want. We can ignore reality. Perhaps we can ignore these old ideas about meaning and purpose, and we can make it whatever we want it to be, and that includes governments and culture and whatever, and art. So we can make it whatever we want it to be. So that's another way of thinking. And so both of these are living side by side in our world right now. There are those of us who see that, believe and know that God has given us a design, a designed universe. He has given us a world. He has given us laws of nature. He has given us ethics and morality. He's given us bodies. He's given us um, standards by which to live by. And so our job is to discover that those standards and the meaning that God has built into His universe, and to conform to it, to live by reality. But there are a lot of people who are thinking in this second way, that they get to make the world whatever they want it to be. And so let me go on to the book by Sean McDowell and John Stonestreet called Same-Sex Marriage, because they give a really great timeline of things that they call the cosmological shift. And I want to walk through this because some of the ideas are very similar, but it also helps us fill in some more gaps regarding the way people think. So they start basically with Charles Darwin, and they say that Darwin challenged the idea that man was created in the image of God. And if we're not created in the image of God, then I guess Darwin says that we're basically accidents, and we're just highly evolved animals. And so humans became animals. Humans are animals of some kind, highly evolved, but we're still animals. And survival of the fittest means that we mate and reproduce out of instinct, not morality. There's no morality attached to it. It's just that we have to keep our gene pool alive, and so we mate and we make babies so that we can live on somehow, in an evolutionary sort of way. And then they also refer to Sigmund Freud and how he taught that sexual ethics grounded on Christianity were oppressive and they should be discarded, because basically it spoils the um, the uh, the inherent nature of human beings, because we're inherently sexual, and Christianity's rules don't let us explore and have the freedom that we want. So it is true that many of Freud's ideas have been discredited. If you talk to somebody who knows psychology, they'll say nobody reads Freud anymore, nobody cares. But actually, that's true that many of his ideas have been discredited, except his take on sexuality. His take on sexuality um, has, at least for now, has had a tremendous impact on how psychology thinks and functions. And so we can't just dismiss him because a lot of his ideas have been discredited, because his influence is still strong in the area of sexuality. Uh, Along comes another person named Margaret Sanger, who founded Planned Parenthood. And if you read her writings, she was not interested really at all in people parenting well. She wasn't that concerned about parenthood. She was concerned about sexual freedom. And she believed in an earthly paradise, that an earthly paradise, what would that look like? It would be total sexual freedom. And so birth control and abortion were a means to that end of complete sexual freedom, or an earthly paradise of complete sexual freedom. So birth control would keep us from the the horrible consequence of sex, and that is having babies, and that would prevent that. But then lo and behold, oh, those aren't 100% effective. So that's why Planned Parenthood has become the largest provider in the world of abortions. And so she has had a tremendous impact in this cosmological shift. There's also Alfred Kinsey, and Kinsey is most widely known for the Kinsey Report. He did lots of experiments that have now been discredited because they were monstrous. He did sexual experiments on babies, infants. He did a lot of his experiments trying to identify so-called normal behavior, but all of his subjects were sexual deviants, sexual predators, and homosexuals, and others. And so his experiments have been discredited, but his influence is still quite strong. Um, he taught that it was outdated to call any sexual behavior deviant and criminal. He got that idea out there in the conversation. Who are you to call this person's sexual behavior deviant and criminal? And so suddenly sexual standards, biblical sexual standards, Christian sexual standards were considered bigoted and oppressive and cruel. And so Kinsey got these ideas out there. And then Hugh Hefner was actually a committed disciple of Kinsey. And so you can see that Kinsey's influence continues in the empire that Hugh Hefner built. Hefner said that Playboy freed a generation from guilt about sex. And to some extent, you can't argue with him. I think that sexual activity outside of a committed marital relationship necessarily, by God's design, comes with guilt and all kinds of repercussions. But to some extent, he is correct that Playboy over time has really at least created the illusion that sex is um, uh, sexual activity and pornography outside of the marriage relationship is just a basic human right and a basic freedom. So Playboy started out very tame. As I understand it, there were not even nude pictures in the original Playboy magazine. Um, but a lot of what was in there originally would be considered tame today. It would be things that maybe you would see in a fashion magazine or catalog. Um, but of course, everything is acceptable now, or at least being photographed and filmed and so forth. We now have what people have called a pornified culture. What Hefner said would happen. We have pornified culture, and so probably most people haven't heard of Mary Calderon, but she was in charge of the Sexuality Information and Education Council. It sounds pretty good, actually. It sounds like a good institution for the betterment of mankind. But it was actually um, an arm of the Kinsey Institute. Remember the name Kinsey, who has largely been discredited, but not before he made a fortune and started the Sexuality Information and Education Council. But this council created the most influential resource for sex education in the public schools. I don't know how widely that is used today, but it had a tremendous impact. Again, the most influential resource ever created for the public schools. And so the Kinsey Institute, a monstrous scientist, and the inspiration behind Playboy, was actually in charge of developing a resource for sex education in the public schools, and ultimately it was funded by Playboy as well. So you can kind of see where that curriculum, that resource, was headed as far as what it had to say to the world. Same messages, that it's outdated to call any sexual behavior deviant and criminal, and we just want to free every generation from guilt about sex. McDowell and Stone Street also include some information about no-fault divorce. They include that in this cosmological shift. Sadly, Ronald Reagan, who regretted this later in 1969, signed the first no-fault divorce law in California. And then several other states did it, and divorce and cohabitation just skyrocketed in that next decade. And by the early 1980s, it reached its highest peak ever. And so what happened here was a new approach to marriage, where the primary obligation shifted from the family and even culture or society to some extent to the individual. In other words, if I'm not happy, I want out of that marriage, I will get a divorce. Divorce became so easy that people could quickly and easily get a divorce if they were no longer happy in their marriage, or if they, for whatever reason, no fault. It's called no fault because for whatever reason, people can get a divorce. And so this shifted the perspective, the approach, the purpose of marriage. Whereas marriage used to be something that was obviously it was something that people did for themselves. That's always been the case, um, or not always, but in Western kind of romanticized culture, marriage has long held um, a personal aspect where people, were getting married to be happy, but they also stayed married, partly because it was hard to get a divorce, but partly because um, it was better. It was better for the kids, for parents to stay together. It was even better for society and for the church, for people to stay together and hopefully work things out. But staying together was thought of as better. But now the approach shifted to my own personal happiness. Marriage is about my own personal happiness, and they say that same-sex marriage became reasonable in that environment. If marriage is about my personal happiness, then why shouldn't I be able to marry whoever I want, even if it's someone of the same sex? And so that's the cosmological shift that McDowell and Stone Street say that has taken place, and they add to Carl Trueman's timeline of the revolution in thought. Okay, so they go on and they say this: sexual identity is human identity, religious identity is not. This is the cosmological shift that has taken place in the West. That's really, that summarizes a lot of material right there. They say the historic Western understanding of the human person was that we are fundamentally religious creatures. Such a big idea. This is the way things have been for centuries, and the way that a lot of us still think. We still think of ourselves as fundamentally religious, fundamentally metaphysical, spiritual. All right. So it was commonly held that the most important thing about humans is the metaphysical search for the meaning and purpose of life, the spiritual. We think of ourselves primarily as souls and people who were created in the image of God, who are to discover God and know Him and our purpose for life. So for many, this was considered more fundamental to human identity than physical survival or sexual pleasure. Okay, so this is the way things used to be, but they've shifted. They say, in other words, humans were humans because they wrestled with the big ultimate questions of existence, such as, where did everything come from? Why is anything here? Is there a God? What is right and wrong? How do we know? That's epistemology. How do we know what we know? So in this new way of seeing things, religious belief is relegated to the realm of the personal and private, but sexual choices are enshrined and considered self-defining. So no longer am I defined as a human who wants and needs to discover why I'm here and what life is all about. But no, what I really need to do is discover who I am sexually, what my true identity is. So this is describing the shift that has taken place. And so they say this shift from seeing people as fundamentally religious creatures, seeing them as fundamentally sexual creatures, is the fertile ground in which same-sex marriage has flourished. And I would add now, again, this was written in 2014, I would add now, 10 years later, that this is the fertile ground in which transgenderism and even abortion have flourished. And I'll explain that in a second. But in this brave new world, they say, sexual choice takes precedence over any presumed purpose of marriage. If this analysis is true, the battle over same-sex marriage was decided in many ways decades ago. And I just agree with this. Okay, so same-sex marriage didn't just all of a sudden happen. We've been leading up to this for a long time, and it's really gets down to that shift that has taken place from being fundamentally religious creatures to now seeing, at least a lot of people in our culture now see themselves as fundamentally sexual. Now, let me go on to Nancy Pearcey's book and let Nancy add to this conversation, I think, in a really helpful way. She wrote Love Thy Body, and this was 2018. But she says this in the past, and this is again looking back at Western civilization and even beyond, most civilizations held that reality consists of both a natural order and a moral order integrated into an overall unity. Therefore, our knowledge of reality was likewise thought to be a single unified system of truth. So I've got it represented there in the big blue bubble, reality. And it's all one bubble of natural order and moral order. Everything is kind of integrated. There's no separation between what we see, feel, taste, touch, and what we think and what we value. Okay, it's all integrated into one reality. But in the modern age, however, she says, many people came to think that reliable knowledge is possible only of the natural order of empirically testable scientific facts. What does that imply for moral truths? Well, they cannot be stuffed into a test tube or studied under a microscope. Many people concluded that morality does not qualify as objective truth. It consists of merely personal feelings and preferences. The unified concept of truth has been exploded, split into two separate domains. So look at the blue bubble again and how reality has now been split. And she talks about how Francis Schaeffer was writing about this way back in the 80s and saying this shift was taking place. This split was taking place between the upper story and the lower story. The upper story being values, private, subjective, relativistic things like theology and morality, whereas the lower story, really the basic biological, even less important facts, public, objective, valid for everyone, science, was being split from the values, the higher story, the upper story. So what does this mean for the human? If we split the human between values and facts, this is what we get. The person, the real person behind the body. This is what I feel I am. This is my authentic self. And so the body is empirical science. Can't deny that I'm a human. These are biological facts, but the real person is what I feel I am, my authentic self. Pearcey goes on. She says, the key to understanding all the controversial issues of our day is that the concept of the human being has likewise been fragmented into an upper and lower story. Secular thought today assumes a body-person split, with the body defined in the fact realm by empirical science, that's the lower story, and the person defined in the values realm as the basis for rights, upper story. This dualism has created a fractured, fragmented view of the human being, in which the body is treated as separate from the authentic self, the personhood. All right, so let's look at this in terms of abortion. Almost everybody would agree that a baby is a human being from conception. Science teaches that, at least, even if there are still people who deny it. A baby is a human being from conception, but not a person until sometime later. And this is, I first realized this in discussions about abortion. I started realizing that people thought of babies as human. That's undeniable. That's science. It's not, in other words, it's not a dog or an elephant in the uterus of a human woman. We know it's a human being, but it doesn't become a person until later. This is how people have justified late-term abortion or even infanticide in some cases, the person isn't uh, aware. They're not conscious of who they are or what they are. So this is how much abortion is justified. It's not a person yet. It's a baby. It's a human, but it's not a person. And so a lot of those debates, that's behind the debate. And so people who disagree are not understanding that, and they're having the wrong debate, really. Um, Piercy says this is called personhood theory, and it is an outworking of the fact value split. To be biologically human is a scientific fact, but to be a person is an ethical concept defined by what we value. And so we've come to this place where someone could say, my physical body is sexed as a man or a woman, but my personhood and identity are not my body. That's a statement, and perhaps you've heard it. Um, my body is not me. I am not my body. I'm more, and that's true that we are more than our body, but it's a big leap to say that I am not my body. All right. My personhood is totally distinct from my body. My identity is totally distinct from my body. All right. So Piercy says a person involved in same sex behavior may not consciously intend to disparage the body, but our actions have logical implications we have not clearly thought through. Whether we've thought through it or not, same-sex behavior disparages the body. Our choices imply an entire metaphysic in this case, the same two-story divided worldview with its negative view of embodied existence. No wonder the New Testament says same-sex activity dishonors the body. That's Romans 1:24. Therefore, God gave them up to the dishonoring of their bodies. So this is getting at the solution. So hang on with me here, because there are implications to this fact value split. There are real world implications to it that a lot of people who have adopted this way of thinking haven't really thought through. She goes on. We live in a moral wasteland where human beings are desperately seeking answers to hard questions about life and sexuality, but there is hope. In the wasteland, we can cultivate a garden. All right, she's getting at what should we do about this? We can discover a reality-based morality that expresses a positive, life-affirming view of the human person, one that is more inspiring, more appealing, and more liberating than the secular worldview. By contrast with the secular worldview, it will become clear that a biblical ethic affirms a full-orbed, holistic view of the person that supports human rights and dignity. So people who currently deny that a man can become a woman and a woman become a man and so forth. They were accused of not supporting human rights and dignity. But the reality is that we can offer a holistic, a much better vision of who the person is than that more common, or that increasingly common secular worldview of the split between personhood and body, or facts and values. Okay, in other words, she sums it up well here. Many people denounce biblical morality as harsh and judgmental, but in reality, it is based on a respect for our biology as an integral part of the person. It offers a rich, multidimensional view of what it means to be human. And this is what we can offer the world, is a multidimensional view of our humanity, a reality that respects the biology as much as it respects the values and the identity and the personhood. And it's all holistic. and it's all related. Okay. So, in other words, what should the church be doing at this present moment? Okay, this is going back to Truman and some ideas that he presents, and I'm kind of summarizing them with my own thoughts here. He says, first of all, reflect long and hard on the connection between aesthetics and her core beliefs and practices. Emphasize truth, doctrine, and forego indulging in and thereby legitimizing the kind of aesthetic strategy of the wider culture. In other words, what he's getting at here, it's not immediately clear, but what he's getting at is that we need to be very careful about how we address these ideas. In other words, we need to. It's very common for us to just by default use the same tools or weapons, if you will, to fight this battle as the wider culture around us. So, say for example, we may say, well, this generation has a short attention span, so we're not going to write books, we're not going to write papers, we're not going to challenge them to read. We're going to try to say everything in 30 seconds or a minute. We're going to make videos and films, and we're going to ignore, we're just going to give in to the culture and not communicate our ideas in the old-fashioned way of writing words and writing books. So that's one approach that a lot of people are taking, is we got to reach this culture with videos and we got to reach them with film. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong. And what Truman is saying is we have to think long and hard about that. Do we really want to encourage short attention spans? Do we really want to encourage the inability to read and follow a clear train of thought, as I've done here for about an hour? I know this is a video, but this is a sustained argument here. This is a lengthy train of thought here that I've asked you to follow. Do we really want to abandon that and try to reach this culture with YouTube shorts and not expect, not insist that we think about these things more deeply? I think that's kind of what he's getting at there. And I agree with him that we need to really think carefully about how we're going to step into this conversation. He also says that the church must be a community. Our moral consciousness is very much shaped by our community. And for this reason, the church needs to be a strong community. I've been saying this for a long time now, that the church cannot be passive. We cannot come together and be passive and be acquaintances that come together to sing songs and listen to a sermon once a week. We cannot be that. That's not a community. That's not going to shape our children's lives. That's not and the way that they think and the way that we all think. The church has to be a community that is in dialogue, impacting one another's ideas and thoughts, and helping us to not be conformed to the world around us, but being transformed by the renewing of our minds. That happens in community. It's critical that we understand that, and do what we have to in order for the church to become community. That may mean that we need to redesign our services. That may mean that we need to commit ourselves to small groups where we haven't perhaps before, and so forth. So we need to design our gatherings and our time together perhaps differently. And Protestants need to recover both natural law and a high view of the physical body. And closely allied is the fact that the church must maintain its commitment to biblical sexual morality, whatever the social cost might be. So in other words, what Nancy Piercy was talking about there, we need to present a holistic view of the human person, the human individual, as both facts and values, as both uh, a body, a physical person, as well as a a person, a integrated, that's the word I'm trying to think of, an integrated view of reality and the whole person, and to not disparage the body, not think that we can shape it however we want or use it however we want, because it's a part of who we are. It's a part of our identity. And I would say a God-given identity, and it includes the biology, the physical body. And so that means that we have to stay committed to the biblical purity, biblical sexual morality, and not affirm something that goes against it. We must maintain that regardless of the social cost. So these are great ideas, great direction. They're not simplistic answers to what must be done, because we are in difficult times. But that doesn't mean that we should give in to them, and it certainly doesn't mean that that there's not a healthy biblical way to respond. We need to be very careful about how we respond. We need to be very committed to the church community and the shaping of a new generation and the shaping of all those who are following Christ. And we also need to stay committed to the biblical view of persons and the biblical view of sexuality. So if you have any questions, let me know. My Calvary email address is the best way to get a hold of me. But I encourage you to share these ideas and to read those books that I've highlighted here, and to engage with this conversation with compassion, with love, and to not give up, because it seems like the whole world has turned upside down, but to engage with it, understand it, and just be the church and be a biblical Christian with a biblical worldview. Let me know if you have any questions.